The bill came to the table on a heavy little tray, folded once, the way good restaurants still do it even now, and before the waiter had fully set it down, my daughter-in-law reached over and slid it toward my son's side of the table without so much as glancing at me. "He's not paying," Kim said, nodding in my direction without quite looking at me either. "He's just the driver." The waiter, a young man I didn't recognize, hesitated for half a second, the particular hesitation of someone who has been trained to read a room and has just noticed something doesn't add up. Before he could say anything, the restaurant's manager, who had been making his rounds through the dining room, stopped at our table, and his whole face changed the moment he saw me. "Mr. Cobb," he said, and there was warmth in it, real warmth, the kind you can't fake in front of strangers. "I had no idea you were dining with us tonight. Please, let me have the sommelier bring out the '09 Barolo, on the house, obviously. It's not every night we get to serve the man who taught half this kitchen how to actually cook." I watched my daughter-in-law's face do something complicated in the span of about 2 seconds, confusion, then something colder underneath it, then a smile stretched carefully back into place, the kind of smile you put on when you've just realized you've said something in front of the wrong audience. Before we go any further, a quick note. This story includes some fictional elements woven together to explore a real and, I think, important lesson, and any resemblance to actual people or places is entirely coincidental. If this kind of content isn't for you, that's completely understandable. Feel free to find something else on the channel. But if you've ever been made to feel small by the very people who should have known better, stay with me, because tonight's story is about exactly that, and about what happens when the person being dismissed turns out to know a great deal more than anyone at the table assumed. I think you'll find, by the end of it, that the most useful weapon in Nate's whole ordeal was never anger. It was simply the willingness to keep quietly paying attention long after everyone around him assumed he'd stopped. My name is Nathaniel Cobb. Most people who've known me more than an hour call me Nate. I'm 74 years old, and 40 years ago, with a $9,000 loan from my father-in-law and a used walk-in cooler I bought off a failing diner 2 towns over, I opened a restaurant called Cobb's Chop House in a storefront that had been a shoe repair shop for 30 years before that. I ran that restaurant myself for the next 31 years, cooking on the line most nights for the first decade, then managing the floor once my knees gave out on the concrete, then finally, in my 60s, stepping back to let a young line cook I'd hired as a 19-year-old dishwasher take over as executive chef and eventual majority partner. His name is Vincent Marlowe, and when he bought out my day-to-day operating role 8 years ago, we structured the sale so that I kept a silent minority equity stake in the restaurant group he built from that single storefront into 4 locations across the region, now operating under the name Marlowe Hospitality. I still hold roughly 18% of the parent company. I still eat there most weeks. And every single member of that staff, from the newest server to Vincent himself, treats me like family, because in every way that matters, I am. My wife, Rosalind, everyone called her Roz, passed 3 years ago this coming winter, after a long decline that started with a diagnosis none of us wanted to say out loud for the first several months. We had one son, Preston, born the year I turned 31, back when the restaurant was still just a dream with a $9,000 loan attached to it, and Preston grew up in the apartment above the original storefront before Roz and I could afford a house of our own, doing his homework at a 2-top in the corner of the dining room most weeknights while I worked the line. He went into commercial real estate after college, which Roz and I were proud of even though neither of us fully understood what it meant, and 6 years ago he married a woman named Kim Ashcroft, whose family runs a boutique hotel development firm called Ashcroft Hospitality Ventures, headed by her father, Douglas Ashcroft. I want to be honest about something before I go further, because it matters to the story. I did not dislike Kim in the beginning. I thought she was sharp, ambitious, good for Preston in the ways that mattered. She pushed him toward things he wanted but hadn't quite believed he could reach. What I noticed, over the 2 years following Roz's death, was something more specific than dislike. It was a pattern, the kind you learn to spot after 4 decades in an industry built entirely on reading what people actually want versus what they say they want at the table. Preston and Kim began treating me, in public especially, less like family and more like staff, asking me to pick them up from the airport at odd hours, to drive them to dinners, since you're retired and it's not like you've got anywhere to be, to handle small errands that had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with convenience. I didn't mind the driving, honestly. I like driving. What I minded, slowly, was the tone that crept into how they asked, and the way that tone had started showing up in front of other people, at tables like the one we sat at that night, in a restaurant I had built with my own hands out of a failed shoe repair shop. I should tell you a little more about that restaurant, because it isn't just a business to me, and understanding what it actually is matters to everything that comes after. Roz and I met when we were both 22, at a diner 3 towns over where she waited tables on weekends to help pay for nursing school and I washed dishes to save toward a used car. We married 2 years later in her parents' backyard, with a borrowed grill and a cake her mother made herself. And for the first 8 years of our marriage I worked line cook jobs at 3 different restaurants, learning everything I could about how each kitchen ran, what worked, what didn't, what made regulars come back and what sent them somewhere else. Roz kept a running list, in a spiral notebook she still had decades later, of every idea I came home talking about. Better ways to plate a steak, a smarter way to organize a walk-in, the exact temperature at which a piece of prime rib stopped being forgiving. When my father-in-law offered me that $9,000 loan, it wasn't out of any particular faith in me specifically. It was because Roz had spent 3 years telling her father, patiently and repeatedly, that I was going to do something with all those notebook pages whether he helped or not, and he decided he'd rather be part of it than watch it happen from the sidelines. We opened Cobb's Chop House on a Tuesday in March, in a storefront that still smelled faintly of leather and shoe polish for the first 2 years no matter how much we scrubbed it, with 11 tables, a menu Roz and I wrote together at our kitchen table the night before, and a bank account that had exactly $412 left in it after we paid the first month's inventory bill. I worked the line 7 days a week for the first 3 years. Roz ran the front of house, kept the books, and somehow also raised Preston, who did his homework at a two-top in the corner most weeknights because there was nowhere else for him to be while both his parents worked. I still remember the first night we turned a genuine profit, $18, after everything, and how Roz cried at the kitchen table afterward, not because $18 meant anything on its own, but because it meant the thing we'd built might actually survive. Those early years were harder than I've ever fully described to anyone, including Preston, who was too young at the time to remember most of it clearly. There were months we didn't take a paycheck at all, months Roz quietly sold pieces of jewelry her mother had left her to cover a supplier's invoice, months I genuinely believed, lying awake at 3 in the morning doing math in my head, that we'd made a terrible mistake and would lose everything we'd put into it. Roz never once let me see her doubt it, even on the nights I know now she must have. She'd sit across from me at that same kitchen table, notebook open, and talk through the next week's menu as though our survival weren't in question, and somewhere in that steady, unshakable confidence of hers, I found enough of my own to keep going. I think about that often now, in the context of everything that happened with Preston and Kim. How much of what I eventually built with patience and quiet documentation, I learned first from watching Roz refuse to panic in a kitchen with $412 left in the bank. That history matters here because it's the reason an 18% equity stake in Marlowe Hospitality was never, to me, simply a number on a financial statement. It was the last living piece of something Roz and I built together with our hands and our exhaustion and $18 of profit on a Tuesday night 30 years ago, and it's the reason that when Kim spoke about it in the back seat of my own car, as though it were an untapped asset waiting to be unlocked, something in me went very still and very quiet in a way I hadn't expected. I noticed it the way I used to notice, on a busy Friday night at the Chop House, when a table was about to become a problem before the problem had actually happened. A certain look between 2 guests, a tone shifting half a register, the kind of small, deniable signal that any good restaurateur learns to read the way a sailor reads weather. Individually, none of it meant much. Together, over 18 months, it had started to feel less like family taking family for granted and more like something being carefully constructed. There was one moment months before that dinner ever happened, that I filed away at the time without understanding its weight. My longtime produce supplier, a man named Earl Jessup who'd been delivering to the Chop House every Tuesday and Friday morning for over 20 years, mentioned to me one morning while we were unloading crates of asparagus that he'd run into Preston at the county courthouse a few weeks earlier, filing something in the recorder's office, business-looking papers, didn't want to say what. Funny thing to be doing on a Tuesday morning when I figured he'd be at his own office. Earl laughed when he said it. The easy laugh of a man who meant nothing by the observation except idle curiosity about a familiar face showing up somewhere unexpected. I laughed along with him at the time, said something about real estate developers keeping strange hours, and thought no more of it. It was only much later, once I understood what I was actually looking at, that I recognized Earl's offhand comment for what it had been. The recording of a UCC filing search. I'd eventually learn that Douglas Ashcroft's team had run against my name and the restaurant group's cap table, the first quiet reconnaissance in a plan that hadn't yet reached the dinner table. I want to tell you a little more about the weeks leading up to that dinner, because the celebration itself wasn't the beginning of anything, it was closer to the middle. Preston had been promoted to senior vice president 6 weeks earlier, and in the time between the promotion and the celebration dinner, I'd noticed Kim mentioning, with increasing frequency and increasing casualness, how proud she was of how far the family had come, and how nice it would be, someday, to build something of our own instead of always being the ones managing everyone else's legacy. I'd taken those comments, at the time, as the ordinary ambition of a woman in her 30s who wanted more for her own household than what she'd married into. It was only in hindsight, listening back to that recording from the drive home, that I understood she'd been rehearsing, out loud, in front of me, the emotional framing she intended to use to justify what she and her father had already begun setting into motion. That dinner, the one where Kim told the waiter I was just the driver, was meant to celebrate Preston's promotion to senior vice president at his firm. I had driven all 4 of us there, Preston, Kim, their 8-year-old daughter Nora, and myself, because Preston mentioned they wanted to have wine with dinner and didn't want to worry about driving home, which I understood and offered to handle gladly, the way I always had. Nora had spent the whole ride talking about the bread basket, which she remembered from a previous visit as the good kind, with the honey butter, and I remember smiling at her in the rearview mirror, thinking that whatever tension had been building lately between the adults in the car, at least one person present was looking forward to the evening for exactly the right reasons. The dining room that night was busy in the particular way a Friday evening always was at the flagship location, every table full, the open kitchen visible behind glass at the back of the room, servers moving between tables with the same unhurried confidence I'd spent decades training into every person who ever worked a floor for me. Vincent wasn't scheduled to be in that night, which is part of why what happened surprised me as much as it did. He'd stopped by unannounced, he told me later, because a delivery had come in wrong and he wanted to check the walk-in himself before the dinner rush hit its peak. We were seated at a foretop near the window, and Preston ordered a bottle of the 18 Cabernet without asking me what I might prefer, which wasn't unusual by itself. I've never been particular about wine, and Preston knew that. What struck me more, looking back, was the way Kim ordered for the whole table when the server came to take our food order, including, at the end, and he'll just have whatever's simplest for the kitchen to send out quickly, gesturing toward me without quite looking at me, the way you might refer to a coat check attendant or a valet rather than the man who'd built the restaurant she was sitting in. I let it go at the time. I've let a great many things go over the years in the interest of keeping a pleasant evening pleasant, and I told myself, the way I'd told myself about the wine bottles in the recycling bin and the 4-degree thermostat difference, that it meant nothing on its own. Nora, for her part, spent most of the meal happily narrating the honey butter to anyone who'd listen, and at one point leaned over and whispered to me, with a particular seriousness 8-year-olds bring to small secrets, that she thought the restaurant was the best one in the whole world, probably, which I told her Roz would have agreed with completely. It was, in its own small way, the best part of that entire evening, and I've thought about it often since, how a night that ended in such a stark, deliberate humiliation still contained, right alongside it, a granddaughter's uncomplicated joy in honey butter and a restaurant that had once been nothing but a failed shoe repair shop. The bill came to the table on a heavy little tray, folded once, the way good restaurants still do it even now, and before the waiter had fully set it down, my daughter-in-law reached over and slid it toward my son's side of the table without so much as glancing at me. Vincent Marlowe handled the moment at our table with more grace than I probably deserved credit for teaching him. He didn't make a scene. He simply pulled out the chair beside me, sat down for a moment the way old friends do, and said, loudly enough for the table to hear but gently enough that it never felt like an accusation, "Nate here taught me how to break down a whole side of beef before I could legally drink. Everything good about this place, we built together." He patted my shoulder, stood, and told the table the wine and dessert were on the house, for the founder and his family, and walked off toward the kitchen, leaving behind a silence at our table that none of us quite knew how to fill. Kim recovered faster than Preston did. She laughed, a bright, easy laugh that cost her something I could tell, because it came half a second too late. "Well, aren't you just full of surprises tonight, Nate?" she said, reaching for her wine glass. Preston said nothing at all, which told me more than anything Kim could have said. I drove them home that night in the same quiet I'd driven them in 100 times before, Nora asleep in her booster seat in the back within 10 minutes, Preston and Kim talking softly to each other in the back seat the way people do when they've forgotten, or never quite considered, that the person driving them can hear every word. I should explain something here, because it matters to everything that happened after. 15 years ago, on a rainy Thursday evening in November, a driver ran a red light 2 blocks from the restaurant and hit my sedan broadside as I was coming back from a supplier meeting, hard enough to spin the car a full quarter turn and send me into the guardrail on the opposite curb. I walked away with nothing worse than a cracked rib and a totaled sedan, which the responding officer at the scene told me, more than once, was close to a miracle given the angle of impact. What I didn't expect was the 6 months that followed, in which the other driver's insurance company, working from a police report that had gotten a key detail wrong about which light had actually been red, tried repeatedly to establish that I had been the one at fault, dragging out a claims process that cost me thousands of dollars in legal fees and no small amount of sleep, all because there had been no independent record of what actually happened at that intersection, only 2 conflicting accounts and a harried officer's imperfect notes taken in the rain. Roz was the one who suggested the dashcam, not long after that ordeal finally resolved in my favor, mostly through the stubborn persistence of a lawyer friend who'd done the work at a steep discount out of pure irritation at how the insurance company had handled it. "I don't want you spending another 6 months proving something that a little camera could prove in 6 seconds, she told me, and she was right, the way she usually was about things that seemed small at the time and turned out to matter enormously later. I installed one in the sedan that replaced the totaled one, and then in every car after that, one that recorded both the road ahead and the cabin behind the driver's seat, with continuous audio, uploading automatically to a cloud account the moment it found a wireless signal. It had nothing to do with suspicion of anyone in particular, then or for the next 14 years. It was simply, by the time any of this with Kim and Preston began, as automatic a habit as checking my mirrors before I pulled out of a driveway, a small, quiet insurance policy against exactly the kind of situation where 2 conflicting accounts and nobody's clear memory decide what actually happened. I think about that rainy Thursday often now, in a way I never expected to. Roz suggested that camera to protect me from a stranger's insurance company. 15 years later, it protected me from my own family instead, and I don't know whether she would have found that fitting or simply heartbreaking, and I suspect, honestly, it would have been some complicated mixture of both. I did not think about that dashcam once, that whole drive home, until 3 days later, when I sat down out of idle habit to clear old footage off the cloud account, the way I do every few weeks, and found myself listening, almost by accident, to the audio from that exact drive. "He clearly has more money tied up in that place than he's ever told us," Kim was saying, her voice pitched low but perfectly clear on the recording, the particular clarity that comes from a microphone placed 6 feet away in an otherwise quiet car. 18% of a 4-location restaurant group. Do you have any idea what that's actually worth, Preston? We've been trying to get him to liquidate a chunk of his portfolio into your father's hotel project for a year, and this whole time there's been an entire other asset we didn't even know to ask about. He's not going to just hand that over, Preston said. He built that place. It's basically the only thing he has left of himself since Mom died. Which is exactly why he needs to diversify, Kim said, in the tone of someone reciting an argument she'd rehearsed more than once. My father's capital call for the boutique hotel deal closes in 10 weeks. If we can get Nate to convert even a third of that equity stake into a cash contribution toward Ashcroft Hospitality, we solve 2 problems at once. Dad gets his capital, and we finally have some real leverage instead of just being the kid whose father-in-law owns a chop house. He'll want a lawyer to look at anything before he signs it, Preston said. Then we don't ask him to sign anything directly, Kim said. Dad already talked to someone about structuring it as a voluntary conversion request through the restaurant group's own transfer agent, using the equity documentation Nate signed years ago when Vincent bought him out. If the paperwork looks routine enough, a standard equity conversion form, nothing dramatic, most people don't read every line. Especially not someone who trusts his own son. "I don't love this, Kim," Preston said, and there was something in his voice that I've turned over many times since, a hesitation that wasn't quite objection. "He's my dad. If this goes sideways, it's not your relationship with him that gets destroyed." "Nothing's going sideways," Kim said. "That's the whole point of doing it this way instead of just asking him outright and giving him the chance to say no and think less of us for asking. Once it's done, it's done. He'll be upset for a while maybe, but he'll get over it, the way people always get over money things eventually. And in the meantime, my dad's project actually breaks ground instead of collapsing, and we finally stop being the family that everyone quietly pities for needing a favor every few months." "And if the transfer agent asks him to verify it?" "They won't," Kim said. "Dad's already confirmed the request can go through under a routine administrative category if it's worded carefully enough. These places process hundreds of these a month. Nobody's got time to call every account holder personally to double-check a form that already has a valid signature on file." A pause, and then, quieter, almost to herself. "It's not stealing, Preston. It's just moving money to where it's actually needed instead of sitting there earning almost nothing in some restaurant group's cap table. He'll still have most of it. We just need enough to get my father through this one deadline. And after that? After that, we never have to talk about it again," Kim said. "I promise you that." I sat in my kitchen with my coffee going cold in front of me, listening to my daughter-in-law describe exactly how she intended to take apart the one thing in this world, besides my son and granddaughter, that I still had left of the life Roz and I built together. I played that section of the recording 4 more times that morning, not because I'd misunderstood anything the first time, but because some part of me kept hoping, foolishly, that a 5th listen might reveal a different meaning than the one that had been sitting there plainly all along. I want to tell you now about the part of this that I'm not proud of, which is that I did not confront either of them that week. I did not call Preston and ask him directly whether he knew what Kim was planning, or whether he'd already agreed to it. I have thought about why, many times since, and I think the honest answer is the one I'd give about almost anything in my working life. You don't send a table's complaint back to the kitchen screaming. You find out quietly, calmly, exactly what went wrong and who was responsible for it, and you fix the actual problem instead of the first thing that made you angry. 40 years in that business taught me that anger solves almost nothing on its own. Patience, paired with the right information, solves almost everything. So I called Vincent. Vincent Marlowe had been part of my life for 22 years by that point, since the day he showed up at the Chophouse's back door at 19 years old, needing a job badly enough that he didn't even ask what the job paid before saying yes. I trusted him with almost everything, and I trusted him now with the recording, sitting across from him in his cramped office above the flagship location, surrounded by delivery invoices and a framed photograph of the two of us from the restaurant's 10th anniversary, both of us younger and considerably more tired-looking than we are now. He listened to it twice without saying anything. When it ended the second time, he set his phone down on the desk between us and rubbed both hands over his face, the way he used to do at 2 in the morning after a brutal Saturday service. "Nate," he said, "you know what this means for the restaurant group, right? If they're trying to use old equity transfer paperwork to structure some kind of conversion without your direct, informed consent, that's not just a family problem. That touches the company's cap table, our other investors, everything we built." "I know," I said. "I need to know exactly what paperwork they think they can use before I do anything else." Vincent pulled up the restaurant group's transfer agent records on his laptop, and together we found what Kim had been referring to, a standard equity conversion authorization form, largely boilerplate, that I had indeed signed 8 years earlier as part of the original buyout paperwork, granting the transfer agent limited authority to process routine administrative changes to my holdings. The kind of form meant for address updates and beneficiary designations, not the conversion of an 18% equity stake into an entirely different asset class. If someone submitted a request using this authorization, claiming it covered a full conversion, our transfer agent might not catch the overreach on their own, Vincent said. They process hundreds of these a month. They rely on the requesting party characterizing the request accurately. He looked at me. "You need a lawyer. Today, not next week. There's something else," I said. Earl Jessup mentioned to me a few months back that he ran into Preston at the county recorder's office, filing something he wouldn't explain. I laughed it off at the time. Vincent went quiet for a moment, tapping his pen against the desk. I want to pull our own corporate records, he said finally, just to make sure nothing's been filed against the restaurant group itself that we haven't caught. If Ashcroft's people have been doing reconnaissance for months, a courthouse filing search on the parent company's structure wouldn't surprise me. That's usually step one for anyone trying to figure out exactly what a piece of equity is actually worth and how it's legally structured, before they decide how to go after it. How would we even find that out? County Recorder's Office keeps a public index of who's requested certified copies of certain filings, Vincent said. It's not usually something people think to check, because it's meant for real estate records, but corporate filings for a company like ours sometimes route through the same office depending on how the original paperwork was structured. I'll have our corporate counsel pull it this week. If Preston's name or Douglas Ashcroft's name shows up on that index a few months back, that tells us this wasn't a spontaneous decision made over one dinner. It tells us they'd been planning this for a while. That confirmation came back 4 days later, and it did not surprise me by then, though it still landed with a particular weight. Preston's name appeared on the recorder's office request index in February, 5 months before the celebration dinner, requesting a certified copy of the restaurant group's original operating agreement, the very document that defined the scope and limitations of every equity holder's rights, including mine. He was studying the fine print of what he could and couldn't touch, 5 months before that dinner, I said, when Vincent's corporate counsel confirmed it. That's what it looks like, Vincent said quietly. I'm sorry, Nate. The following morning, I drove to see a lawyer named Renee Whitcomb, whom I'd known for nearly a decade after she'd handled the original buyout agreement with Vincent on my behalf. She specialized, among other things, in closely held business disputes, the kind of law that exists specifically because people occasionally decide a quiet paper trail is easier than an honest conversation. I brought her everything. The dashcam recording, which she confirmed our state permitted, since it had been made in my own vehicle, with me present as a party to the conversation, under a single-party consent standard that covered exactly this kind of situation. The original equity conversion authorization form, and Vincent's explanation of how narrowly it had actually been intended to apply. The recorder's office confirmation that Preston had requested a certified copy of the operating agreement 5 months before the dinner. And a name I'd heard for the first time on that recording, Ashcroft Hospitality Ventures, and Douglas Ashcroft's 10-week capital call deadline. Renee listened to the recording twice, the second time with a legal pad in front of her, pen moving steadily. When it ended, she set the pen down. Mr. Cobb, she said, I want to be very direct with you. What you've described is not a family disagreement about financial planning. This is an attempt to misuse a limited administrative authorization to execute a conversion of a significant equity stake without your informed, direct consent, and depending on exactly what request gets submitted to your transfer agent, it may constitute securities fraud, in addition to whatever family court or civil remedies might eventually apply. She tapped the folder. The phrase, "we don't ask him to sign anything directly," concerns me most of everything on that recording, because it tells me they already understand this wouldn't hold up if you were asked plainly. What do we do? I asked. First, we notify your transfer agent in writing, immediately, that any request purporting to authorize a conversion of your equity stake beyond routine administrative changes must be verified directly with you by phone, using a passphrase we established today, before any action is taken, Renee said. That closes the door Kim and her father are trying to walk through. Second, we document everything, quietly, so that if they attempt to submit a request anyway, we have a clear record of an attempted unauthorized transfer, not just a suspicion. She paused. And third, Mr. Cobb, I think you need to consider bringing in the county's financial crimes unit before this goes any further, because if Douglas Ashcroft has structured something like this before with other family members of other clients, this may not be the first time. I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer, I said. Is there any version of this where Preston believes he's genuinely helping his father-in-law without believing he's hurting me, where in his own mind, none of this is theft? Renee considered that for a moment, the way I imagine a good surgeon considers a diagnosis before delivering it. I've seen cases where a spouse gets pulled into a scheme they didn't originate and don't fully understand the legal weight of, she said. The recording suggests Preston had reservations. You can hear him pushing back, asking what happens if you say no, asking what happens if the transfer agent calls to verify. That's not nothing. But reservations aren't the same as refusal, and the recorder's office filing suggests he was involved in scoping this out 5 months before that dinner, well before Kim's supposed idea at the table that night. Whatever story he's telling himself, the evidence doesn't currently support a version where he was simply swept along at the last minute. That's roughly the conclusion I'd already come to, I said. I was hoping you'd tell me I was wrong. I know, Renee said, not unkindly. I'm sorry I can't. What about Nora? I asked. My granddaughter's name came out of me before I'd fully decided to ask the question. If this goes the way I think it's going to go, what happens to her, in all of this? Renee's expression softened slightly, the first real crack in her otherwise composed professional demeanor since I'd sat down. That's not a question I can answer today, Mr. Cobb, she said. But I can tell you that in my experience, the children in situations like this are almost always more resilient and more perceptive than the adults around them give them credit for being. What matters most for her going forward is that at least one adult in her life continues behaving with consistency and honesty, regardless of what happens to everyone else around her. She paused. It sounds like that's already you. I didn't have an answer for that. I sat with it a long moment, the particular ache of understanding that whatever came next, in a courtroom or otherwise, an 8-year-old girl who loved her grandfather and had no idea any of this was happening would be somewhere in the middle of it, whether anyone intended that or not. Renee opened a fresh legal pad. Here's what we're going to do, she said, and began to write. Renee's instinct proved accurate faster than either of us expected. 2 weeks later, her office received a call from my transfer agent's compliance department, flagging a submitted request, using my original signature on file, attached to a cover letter purporting to authorize a routine portfolio rebalancing conversion of 18% equity into a designated third-party account associated with Ashcroft Hospitality Ventures. Because Renee's written notice was already on file, the compliance officer, a careful woman named Priyanka Shah, called Renee's office directly rather than processing the request, exactly as we'd instructed. Ms. Whitcomb, I want to flag something unusual, Priyanka said, on a call Renee patched me into. The cover letter accompanying this request references an authorization form from 8 years ago, but the request itself describes a conversion type and destination account that go well beyond anything that original form contemplated. I've seen this pattern before, unfortunately, older, narrower authorizations being cited to justify requests they were never meant to cover. I'm placing a hold on this file pending direct verification with Mr. Cobb. Thank you for catching this, Ms. Shah, I said. I did not authorize this conversion. There was a pause on the line, the particular pause of a careful professional recalibrating in real time. I understand, sir. Given what you've just told me, our compliance team is required to refer this to our internal fraud review process, and I'd strongly recommend involving local law enforcement, given the scale of the asset involved. I want to tell you about what happened 3 weeks after that first blocked attempt, because it changed how seriously everyone involved understood the scope of what we were dealing with. Priyanka Shah called Renee's office again, this time with something that unsettled even her carefully professional tone. A second request had come in, this time not through the transfer agent's standard submission portal, but through a phone call to their client services line, from someone identifying themselves as me. The caller had my information, my date of birth, the last 4 digits of my account number, I said, once Renee relayed the details to me. How is that possible? Mr. Cobb, I want to ask you something that might feel intrusive, Priyanka said, once Renee had patched her back in. Over the past year, has anyone close to you had regular access to detailed personal information, account statements left out at your house, conversations about your finances where specific numbers might have come up, anything of that nature? I thought about it, turning the question over the way I'd turn over an unfamiliar knife in the kitchen before deciding whether it was sharp enough to trust. Preston helped me set up online access to a few of my accounts a couple of years ago, after Roz passed, when I was still learning how to manage things I'd never had to manage myself, I said slowly. He would have seen account numbers, statement details, all of it, at the time. I never thought anything of it. He was helping his father. That would explain the account number and the date of birth, Priyanka said. The voice on this second call is a different matter entirely. Our verification protocol includes a recorded voice sample comparison for calls of this size, and the sample on this call was flagged by our automated system as an unusually close match to your voice on file, close enough that a human reviewer had to escalate it manually rather than trusting the automated pass. I want to be honest with you, Mr. Cobb. If you hadn't already flagged your account for manual verification after the first attempt, this second call likely would have gone through. I sat with that information a long moment before I could respond. Someone tried to sound like me, I said finally. That's what the pattern suggests, Priyanka said. I've asked our fraud team to preserve the recording of that call in its entirety, along with the metadata showing the originating phone number, which our system captured automatically. I'd strongly recommend your attorney request that recording formally, because if it shows what I suspect it might show, that changes the nature of what you're dealing with considerably. Renee requested the recording the same afternoon, and it arrived 4 days later under a formal preservation request, delivered to her office on a secure drive along with a compliance affidavit from Priyanka Shah's department. We listened to it together in Renee's office, the three of us. Renee, Vincent, who I'd asked to join because I trusted his ear for detail more than almost anyone else's, and me. The voice on the recording was mine, or close enough to mine that, hearing it cold, without context, I might have believed it myself. It answered the standard verification questions in a cadence that sounded almost right, almost like the way I actually speak, with a flatness in certain vowels that Vincent noticed before I did. That's not quite how you talk, Nate, Vincent said, replaying a section a second time. You draw out your O's longer than that, especially when you're being careful with a word. This sounds like somebody who's heard you talk a lot, but isn't actually you. Where would anyone get enough of my voice to build something like this? I asked, though some part of me had already started assembling an answer I didn't want to reach. It was Renee who found it, 3 days later, after subpoenaing records from a video conferencing platform that Preston's real estate firm used for client calls. Preston, it turned out, had recorded several video calls with me over the preceding year, ostensibly, according to messages recovered later, to have some good footage of Dad talking about the old days at the restaurant, before we lose the chance. Messages he'd sent to Kim describing the calls as sentimental preservation, the kind of thing a grieving son does for a widowed father he wants to remember clearly someday. 9 months of recorded conversation, transcribed and analyzed, according to the forensic audio expert Renee eventually retained, provided more than enough raw material for a synthesized voice model convincing enough to pass an automated verification system, though not, fortunately, convincing enough to fool a human reviewer paying close attention. He recorded me for almost a year, I said, when Renee walked me through what her forensic expert had found, under the excuse of wanting to remember me clearly, and used it to build something that could pretend to be my voice authorizing a theft. That's what the evidence indicates, Renee said quietly. I know this is difficult to hear, Mr. Cobb. Take whatever time you need with it. I did not take very much time with it, not because it didn't hurt. It hurt in a way that sat differently than anything else in this whole ordeal, a wound specifically shaped like betrayal rather than greed. But because 40 years of running a kitchen through disasters both large and small had taught me that the feeling arrives whether or not you make room for it, and the work goes better if you let it move alongside you instead of waiting for it to pass first. Renee's contact in the county's financial crimes unit, a patient, methodical detective named Marcus Alvarez, met with us the following week. He reminded me, in his unhurried way of laying evidence out piece by piece, of the best line cooks I'd ever worked with, the ones who never rushed a dish, because rushing was how you burned something you couldn't get back. Mr. Cobb, Alvarez said, after reviewing the dashcam recording, the forged conversion request, the second attempted phone authorization, the synthesized voice recording, and Priyanka Shah's compliance notes, what you've documented here is more complete than most cases we build from scratch. I want to look into Douglas Ashcroft specifically, because this kind of scheme, using narrow, older authorizations to justify broad, unauthorized transfers, backed up by a synthesized voice authorization as a fallback, usually isn't a first attempt for someone sophisticated enough to structure it this cleanly. I also want a forensic audio analyst to formally examine that second call, because if the voice cloning technique used here matches something we've seen in a prior case, that tells us something important about who actually built the tool, not just who used it. Alvarez pulled Douglas Ashcroft's business history over the following weeks, and what emerged was a portrait of a man who had, for nearly 2 decades, presented himself publicly as a steady, community-minded developer while privately cycling through a series of increasingly precarious financing arrangements to keep his projects afloat. He'd started, according to public records, with a single successful boutique hotel renovation in the early years of his career, genuinely well executed, genuinely profitable, and had spent the better part of the following 15 years trying to replicate that early success at a scale his actual capital never quite supported. Men like this rarely think of themselves as thieves, Alvarez told me once, over coffee at Renee's office. They think of themselves as one good deal away from making everything whole again, and in the meantime, they borrow against whatever's closest at hand, always intending, in some genuine part of their own mind, to pay it back before anyone notices the gap. Did he intend to pay me back? I asked. Alvarez considered the question carefully before answering. I think he genuinely believed, at least at first, that he would, he said. That doesn't make what he did any less a crime, and it doesn't make the harm to you, or to Eleanor Voigt, or to Walter Okafor, any less real. But I found, over 20 years doing this work, that understanding a man's self-justification doesn't require excusing his conduct. It just helps you build a case that accounts for how these things actually happen, rather than the simpler story where everyone involved is simply, cleanly a villain. The forensic audio analyst's report came back 6 weeks later, and it confirmed what Vincent had already suspected by ear. The voice sample used on the second attempted authorization had indeed been synthesized, constructed from roughly 9 months of recorded video calls, using commercially available voice cloning software that had, according to the analyst's report, become significantly more accessible to ordinary consumers in recent years. The report noted the same subtle flatness in certain vowel sounds that Vincent had caught immediately, along with a slight, almost undetectable irregularity in the pacing between words, imperfections invisible to an automated system optimized for convenience, but audible to a careful, trained ear. Alvarez's investigation, running quietly through the following 2 months, connected Douglas Ashcroft to a pattern that extended well beyond me. His hotel development firm, it turned out, was significantly over-leveraged, having taken on debt against 3 separate projects that had all stalled in permitting, and the capital call Kim had mentioned on that drive home wasn't an opportunity at all. It was a last, urgent attempt to cover a maturing loan before the whole project collapsed. A forensic accountant working with Alvarez's team traced Ashcroft Hospitality Ventures' financing structure and found 2 prior instances involving other investors' family members, both quietly resolved before regulators pursued the matter seriously. The first, Alvarez explained to us in detail during a meeting at Renee's office, involved a woman named Eleanor Voigt, a 79-year-old widow whose late husband had been an early, minority investor in one of Douglas Ashcroft's earlier hotel projects. 2 years before my own ordeal began, Ashcroft's team had approached Eleanor's son-in-law, a mid-level bank manager named Curtis Boyd, with what they described as a time-sensitive opportunity to consolidate the estate's scattered small holdings into a single, more manageable investment, using an old, narrowly worded authorization from Eleanor's original investment paperwork to attempt a similar conversion. In that case, the attempt had actually gone part way through before Eleanor's own accountant caught the discrepancy during a routine annual review, and Ashcroft's firm, facing the threat of a complaint to the State Securities Board, had quietly reversed the transfer and offered Eleanor a modest settlement in exchange for her silence, which she had accepted, exhausted, at 77, by the mere prospect of a prolonged legal fight. The second, even more troubling to Alvarez's team, involved a retired pharmacist named Walter Okafor, whose daughter had married into the extended Ashcroft family circle through a cousin's wedding several years earlier. In that instance, Douglas Ashcroft himself had structured a similar conversion request using a decade-old authorization form, and when Walter's own bank had flagged it, unlike Priyanka Shah's compliance team, the bank in that case had processed the transfer anyway, due to what an internal review later called a failure in escalation protocol. Walter had lost nearly $90,000 before his family discovered the missing funds during his eventual estate planning process, and by the time they pieced together what had happened, the statute of limitations for a straightforward civil claim had nearly run out, and Walter, in poor health himself by then, had declined to pursue a criminal complaint, telling his daughter he didn't have the years left to spend fighting it. Both of those families let it go, Alvarez told me, because pursuing it felt impossible, or exhausting, or both. Your case is different because you documented everything independently, before you ever came to us, and because your compliance officer did her job the way Eleanor Voigt's bank should have and Walter Okafor's bank didn't. That gives us the foundation to reopen both of their cases as part of a broader pattern, if they're willing to participate now that there's finally a case strong enough to actually hold together in court. I thought about Eleanor Voigt and Walter Okafor for a long time after that meeting. Two people I had never met, whose names I hadn't known existed a few months earlier, whose losses had simply been absorbed and quietly forgotten because the systems meant to protect them hadn't worked the way Priyanka Shah's had worked for me. There was something almost unbearably strange in learning that the harm done to me might also become the thing that finally gave two strangers a path back toward justice they'd each, independently, given up on pursuing. Renee eventually reached out to both families, with Alvarez's blessing, and both Eleanor Voigt's daughter and Walter Okafor's daughter agreed, cautiously at first and then with something that sounded, on the phone, almost like relief, to cooperate with the expanded investigation. My mother cried when I told her someone else had caught it in time, Eleanor's daughter told Renee, in a call I was present for. She always felt like giving up on it was the smart thing to do, the practical thing. I think some part of her has been waiting 2 years for someone to prove her wrong about that. The months that followed were some of the strangest of my life, in the particular way waiting always is when you understand something no one around you knows you understand. Preston and Kim came by for Sunday dinners the same as always, Kim occasionally mentioning, lightly, whether I'd given any more thought to diversifying my portfolio, and I told her both times that I'd been meaning to sit down with my own advisor to review everything now that I was getting older, which made her smile falter for just a fraction of a second each time. The way a server's smile falters when a regular customer asks a question they weren't prepared for. I want to pause here and tell you about a night in that same stretch that was harder, in its own quiet way, than almost anything else in this whole ordeal. It was a Tuesday in December, a few weeks after Christmas, and Preston called me late in the evening, his voice thick in a way that told me before he said a word that something had shifted in him, at least temporarily. He'd had a few drinks, I could tell, though he wasn't drunk exactly, just looser than usual, the way people get when a private worry finally finds an opening to surface. He asked me, out of nowhere, whether I thought he'd turned out to be a good son. I told him carefully that I thought he'd turned out to be a complicated one, the way most people eventually do, and asked him why he was asking. No reason, he said, too quickly. Just thinking about Mom. About whether she'd be proud of where I ended up. I sat with the phone against my ear a long moment, feeling something in my chest that I can only describe as the specific ache of standing at the edge of a door that might, that very night, swing open on its own if I simply pushed on it gently enough. I nearly asked him then, plainly, whether there was anything he needed to tell me. I nearly abandoned everything Renee and Alvarez and months of careful patience had built, for the sake of one honest conversation with my own son on a Tuesday night in December. I did not ask. I told him instead that Roz would be proud of him regardless, because that was true regardless of anything else, and I told him to get some sleep, and I hung up the phone and sat at my kitchen table a long time afterward, turning that almost conversation over in my hands the way I'd turn over a knife I wasn't sure was sharp enough to trust yet. I called Renee the next morning and told her what had happened, and asked her directly whether there was still time to simply sit Preston down and ask him plainly what he knew, in the hope that he might tell me the truth unprompted before any of this became irreversible. You can do that if you want to, Mr. Cobb, Renee said. I won't stop you. But I want you to think carefully about something first. Everything you've shown me so far indicates a plan tested more than once, quietly, over the better part of a year, a courthouse filing 5 months before the dinner, a forged conversion request, a second attempt using a synthesized voice built from 9 months of recorded calls. A son who's made one bad decision under pressure calls his father, drunk and lonely, and confesses on the spot. A son who's been party to something built this carefully, for this long, isn't necessarily looking for an opportunity to come clean just because he's had a few drinks and is missing his mother. He might be. But you're allowed to hope for a version of Preston that doesn't exist yet, Mr. Cobb. I just don't want you to mistake that hope for evidence, especially not at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. I did not call Preston back that week. I sat instead with that particular unnamed grief that doesn't announce itself cleanly. Not anger exactly, and not sadness either, but something adjacent to both. The ache of loving someone whose actions you can no longer explain away with a version of them you remember from before. Nora, meanwhile, had no idea any of this was happening, and I worked hard, harder than almost anything else during that whole waiting period, to make sure it stayed that way. She was 8 years old, deep into a phase of wanting to learn everything about the restaurant business, asking me constant questions about how the kitchen worked, why we used certain knives for certain jobs, whether she could someday come work the line the way I had at her age, though of course child labor laws meant she'd have to wait considerably longer than that. I started bringing her in on slow Tuesday afternoons, letting her stand on a step stool beside the pastry station while Vincent's dessert chef, a patient young woman named Odessa, taught her how to pipe a basic buttercream rosette onto a practice board. Those afternoons became, without my fully realizing it at the time, the thing that kept me steady through the worst of the waiting, a reminder that whatever her parents were doing in rooms I wasn't present for, there was still a whole unspoiled person in this family who loved the restaurant and loved me without any complicated motive attached to either. She asked me once, on one of those Tuesday afternoons, sitting on the step stool with buttercream on her sleeve, why I always drove everyone everywhere instead of just riding along like a passenger sometimes. I told her, honestly, that I liked driving, that it gave me time to think, and that as long as I was able to do it, I intended to keep doing it for the people I loved. She considered that with the particular seriousness that only children bring to questions adults have stopped taking seriously, and said, "I think that's a nice way to love people. Doing something for them instead of just saying it." I did not have an answer for that, not one I trusted myself to say out loud without my voice breaking, so I just told her the rosette needed a little more pressure at the base, and let the moment pass. There was one more development during that long waiting period that I want to tell you about, because it very nearly changed how everything unfolded. In February, for months after the transfer agent blocked the second synthesized voice call, I received an unexpected visit at the restaurant from a man I didn't recognize, well-dressed, mid-40s, who introduced himself as a family friend of the Ashcrofts, and asked, over coffee I hadn't invited him to share, whether I'd be open to resolving this whole misunderstanding privately, family to family, before it became something none of us could walk back. He mentioned, carefully, that Douglas Ashcroft would be willing to make a generous gesture of goodwill if I were willing to consider the matter closed and decline to pursue anything further with the detective I'd apparently already been in contact with. I recognized, sitting across from that man, the same instinct I'd trained into every server who'd ever worked a difficult table under me. The instinct to stay calm, stay pleasant, and give away nothing until you understood exactly what was actually being asked of you. He'd ordered a coffee he barely touched, made small talk about the restaurant's reputation for a few minutes before getting to the actual purpose of his visit, and I remember thinking, watching him work through his careful, rehearsed opening, that whoever had coached him on this approach had clearly done this kind of conversation before. He never once used the word settlement or payment directly, always circling it with softer language, a gesture, something to make things right between families, an arrangement that spares everyone the difficulty of a public process. I told him I appreciated him stopping by, that I'd think about what he'd said, and that I needed to get back to the kitchen, and I called Renee from the parking lot the moment he left. "That's witness tampering, Nate, or close enough to it that Alvarez needs to know immediately," Renee said, once I'd relayed the conversation as precisely as I could remember it. "Did you get his name?" I had. Renee passed it along to Alvarez within the hour, and it turned out the man was an associate of Douglas Ashcroft's who'd made similar approaches, Alvarez's team later confirmed, to both Eleanor Voigt's family and, years earlier, to Walter Okafor's daughter, in each case attempting to head off further investigation with a quiet financial gesture before matters escalated. That attempt, rather than making the case go away, became one more piece of evidence establishing the pattern Alvarez had already begun to suspect, that Douglas Ashcroft, whenever a scheme threatened to unravel, reached first for a private settlement, and only when that failed, for anything resembling an honest accounting of what he'd actually done. I remember one Sunday in particular, in late autumn, when Preston stayed behind after Kim took Nora out to the car, and sat with me at my kitchen table in a silence that felt, for a few minutes, almost like the silences we used to share at the two-top in the corner of the restaurant when he was a boy doing his homework while I worked the line. He asked me, out of nowhere, whether I ever regretted not selling the whole restaurant outright instead of keeping a stake in it. I told him I didn't, that the stake was the last piece of something Roz and I had built together, and that some things were worth more than what they'd sell for. He nodded slowly, and for a moment I let myself believe, foolishly, that some part of him wanted to say something honest and didn't know how to start. The moment passed. Kim knocked on the window from the driveway, and he left without saying whatever it was I'd imagined he might. Detective Alvarez's team obtained warrants in early spring, nearly a year after the night at the chop house. He called me the evening before, the way he'd promised he would, to tell me it would happen the following morning, and to stay away from the restaurant and Preston's house both until he confirmed it was clear. I sat at my kitchen table before dawn, listening to the old clock in the hallway that had hung there since Roz and I first moved in, ticking through the longest hour I'd spent since the week she died. I made a pot of coffee I barely touched, the same way I imagine countless people have sat in countless kitchens waiting for news that would rearrange the shape of their lives, and I thought, more than anything else that morning, about Nora, about whether she'd wake up that day to police cars outside her house, about what her parents would tell her, about whether an 11-year-old's understanding of grown-up problems being handled fairly would hold up against the reality of watching her mother taken into custody. I nearly called Alvarez twice that morning to ask whether there was any way to arrange things so Nora wouldn't be present when it happened. Both times I put the phone back down, understanding that it wasn't my decision to make, and that Alvarez, whatever else was true about the morning ahead, had done this work carefully enough, often enough, to have already thought about exactly that question before I ever did. Alvarez called at 7:30. "It's done, Mr. Cobb," he said. "Douglas Ashcroft has been taken into custody on charges including securities fraud and attempted unauthorized transfer of assets. Kim Cobb is being charged separately based on the recorded conversation and her documented communications with her father. Her attorney is negotiating her surrender. Preston Cobb is being investigated for his level of knowledge and participation, though the evidence currently suggests his involvement was more passive than active." He paused. "Nora wasn't present for any of it. Kim's sister came and got her from school before we executed the warrant at the house. I made sure of that specifically, given what you'd told me about her." I sat with the phone against my ear a long moment before I could answer. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it more than those 2 words could carry. "Thank you for calling me directly," I said. "You built most of this case yourself before we ever got involved," Alvarez said. "Most people in your position spend a year wanting to confront somebody. You spent it documenting instead. That's rarer than you'd think." The months between the arrests and the trial moved the way Renee had warned me they would. Slowly, procedurally, at a pace that had nothing to do with my own sense of urgency. There were arraignments in late spring, brief and formal, where I sat in the back of a courtroom and watched Douglas Ashcroft enter a plea of not guilty in a voice that carried more confidence than the circumstances seemed to warrant. There was a grand jury proceeding in early summer, where I testified for nearly 4 hours about the dinner at the chop house, the dashcam recording, and the forged conversion request Priyanka Shah had refused to process. There were continuances through the following months, a defense motion to suppress the dashcam recording that Renee and Alvarez's office fought and won, establishing on the record that the recording had been made lawfully in my own vehicle, with me present as a party to the conversation, exactly as our state's consent law allowed. Detective Alvarez called every few weeks during that stretch, not always with new developments, sometimes simply to check in, which I came to appreciate more than I expected to. "A lot of victims in cases like this feel like they disappear once the arrests happen," he told me once. "Like the system takes over and forgets there's a person still living through it. I try not to let that happen on my cases." During one of those calls in late summer, he told me the forensic accounting team had finished tracing the full scope of Douglas Ashcroft's over-leveraged position across all 3 of his stalled hotel projects, and that the numbers were worse than even the initial estimates had suggested, enough that Alvarez believed federal prosecutors might eventually take an interest in the case as well, given the scale involved and the interstate nature of some of the financing. That federal interest never fully materialized, in the end, the state's case proving thorough enough on its own that the U.S. Attorney's Office declined to duplicate the effort, but the possibility hung over those months regardless. One more reminder of how much larger this had turned out to be than a single dinner at a restaurant I'd built with my own hands. There was also, during that long waiting period, a strange and unexpectedly tender moment with Earl Jessup, my produce supplier, who I finally told the full story to one Tuesday morning while we unloaded a crate of early spring asparagus, nearly a year after his offhand comment about seeing Preston at the courthouse. Earl set down the crate he was carrying and stood there a long moment, visibly working through something. "I laughed about that, Nate," he said finally. "I made a joke out of it because it seemed like nothing. I've thought about that morning more than I probably should have since Alvarez's office called me a few weeks back asking about it. I told him there was nothing he could have done differently, that a man filing paperwork at a courthouse isn't evidence of anything on its own, and that the only reason any of it mattered in the end was that I happened to remember it at exactly the right moment." Earl didn't seem entirely convinced, and he's been, if anything, a more careful observer of the small, ordinary details of my life ever since. The way people sometimes become after realizing how much weight an offhand comment can carry without anyone intending it to. The trial began the following January, nearly 2 years after that dinner. I will not walk you through every day of it, because much of it unfolded the way these proceedings always do. A forensic accountant explaining Ashcroft Hospitality Ventures' over-leveraged position to a patient jury, a document examiner explaining the gap between what the original authorization form actually permitted and what the submitted conversion request claimed it covered. The forensic accountant, a precise, unhurried man named Stanley Kroger who had spent nearly 30 years untangling corporate finances for the county's white-collar crimes division, walked the jury through Ashcroft Hospitality Ventures books over the course of an entire afternoon, using a large screen mounted at the front of the courtroom to display simplified versions of loan schedules, permit-stalled project timelines, and the maturing debt obligations that had driven Douglas Ashcroft toward increasingly desperate financing structures over the preceding 2 years. "What you're looking at," Kroger told the jury, gesturing toward a chart showing 3 overlapping project timelines, each stalled at various stages of municipal permitting, is a firm that had taken on debt against future revenue that never materialized, on 3 separate projects simultaneously, none of which had broken ground. By the time of the capital call referenced in the recorded conversation between Mr. Cobb's son and daughter-in-law, Ashcroft Hospitality Ventures was, in my professional assessment, functionally insolvent absent an infusion of outside capital within roughly 10 to 12 weeks. He paused, letting that sink in with the jury before continuing. The equity conversion request submitted using Mr. Cobb's authorization wasn't an investment opportunity being offered to him. It was an attempt to plug a specific, quantifiable hole in a company that was, by every conventional measure, already failing. Under cross-examination, Gerald Finch pressed Kroger on whether struggling companies routinely sought capital from a wide range of sources, including family connections, as a matter of ordinary business practice. "Isn't it true, Mr. Kroger, that seeking capital from personal networks is an extremely common practice in real estate development, one that doesn't inherently indicate fraud?" "That's true," Kroger said. "What indicates fraud in this instance isn't that Mr. Ashcroft sought capital from a family connection. It's the specific mechanism used to obtain it, an authorization form limited by its own plain language to administrative changes, cited to justify a request it was never intended to cover, submitted in a manner specifically designed, according to the emails I reviewed, to avoid triggering the account holder's direct verification." He looked toward the jury. "There's a meaningful difference between asking a family member for an investment and using paperwork that family member signed for an entirely different purpose to take the investment without asking." Finch had no effective response to that distinction, and moved to his next line of questioning without pressing further. Priyanka Shah testified on the second day, describing in her calm, professional voice exactly why she'd refused to process the request and referred it instead. "I process hundreds of these authorizations a month," she told the jury. "Most of what crosses my desk is exactly what it claims to be. Every so often, something isn't, and when the mismatch is this significant, an 8-year-old address change authorization being used to justify converting an 18% equity stake, I've learned that the account holder deserves to know before anyone else does." Under cross-examination, Douglas Ashcroft's attorney, a sharp, unflappable man named Gerald Finch, pressed Priyanka on whether her decision to flag the request had been driven by suspicion of his client specifically, rather than genuine procedural concern. "Ms. Shah, isn't it true that you flag a certain percentage of requests every month for manual review as a matter of routine, regardless of the requesting party?" That's correct, Priyanka said evenly. So there was nothing specifically suspicious about this particular request, beyond the mismatch you've already described? The mismatch was the suspicious element, Mr. Finch, Priyanka said. An authorization form limited to address changes and beneficiary designations was cited to justify converting a significant equity stake into a third-party account. That is not a routine discrepancy. That is the specific pattern our compliance training identifies as a leading indicator of elder financial exploitation, and I treated it accordingly. Finch tried a different angle. You testified that a second call came in, purportedly from Mr. Cobb himself, requesting the same conversion. Isn't it possible that call was simply Mr. Cobb changing his mind and deciding to authorize the transaction after all, only for some other family disagreement to cause him to later deny it? No, Priyanka said, without hesitation. Our automated system flagged that call's voice sample for manual review specifically because of an anomaly in the voice pattern, not because of anything Mr. Cobb said, but because of measurable inconsistencies in how the voice was produced. That flag exists independent of any family dynamic. It's a technical assessment, not a judgment call about credibility. The forensic audio analyst, a soft-spoken academic named Dr. Priya Ramanathan, who consulted for law enforcement agencies across 3 states, testified on the third day, walking the jury through the technical process of voice synthesis in language careful enough that even jurors with no technical background could follow it. She played, for the courtroom, a side-by-side comparison of my genuine recorded voice from an earlier verified call and the synthesized voice from the fraudulent authorization attempt, slowed down and isolated so the jury could hear, for themselves, the subtle flatness in certain vowel sounds and the almost imperceptible irregularity in pacing between words that had first caught Vincent's attention. In your professional opinion, Dr. Ramanathan, the prosecutor, a thorough woman named Adiz Bello, asked, what would it have taken to construct a voice model convincing enough to attempt this authorization? Based on my analysis, the model appears to have been trained on somewhere between 8 and 11 months of continuous recorded speech from the subject, Dr. Ramanathan said. That's a substantial amount of source material. It's not something that could be assembled from a handful of casual phone calls. It requires sustained, deliberate recording over an extended period, typically under some pretext that gives the person being recorded no reason to object or grow suspicious. And in your review of the messages provided to you, describing those recordings as being made to have some good footage of Dad talking about the old days, before we lose the chance, does that framing align with what you'd expect to see in a case like this? Objection, calls for speculation about intent, Finch said. Sustained, the judge said. Rephrase, counsel. Bello nodded. Dr. Ramanathan, does the volume and duration of recorded material required to build this voice model align with 9 months of regularly recorded video calls? Yes, Dr. Ramanathan said. That volume of source material is entirely consistent with what I understand to have been recorded over that period. Eleanor Voigt's daughter, a soft-spoken woman named Miriam Voigt Ellis, testified on the 4th day about her mother's experience 2 years earlier, describing the eerily similar pattern, the old, narrow authorization, the vaguely worded conversion request, the quiet reversal once her mother's accountant caught the discrepancy. My mother is 81 years old now, Miriam told the jury, her voice steady despite the visible effort it took her to keep it that way. She spent 2 years believing she'd simply been careless, that it was somehow her own fault for not reading the paperwork closely enough the first time. It wasn't until Detective Alvarez called us that she finally understood it had never been her fault at all. Walter Okafor's daughter, a reserved woman named Adaora Okafor Reyes, no relation, despite the shared surname, to my own family, a coincidence the prosecutor took care to clarify for the jury early in her testimony, described her father's much larger loss, the $90,000 he'd never recovered, and the toll the whole ordeal had taken on a man already managing declining health. My father passed away last spring, she told the jury, and the courtroom went very quiet at that. He never saw this case reach a courtroom. But before he died, he asked me to make sure that if anyone else ever came forward with the same story, I would testify, so that whatever happened to him wouldn't just disappear the way it almost did the first time. She paused, composing herself. I'm here because I promised him that. I sat in the gallery during both of those testimonies with my hands pressed flat against my knees, thinking about how close my own case had come to disappearing the same quiet way theirs had. If Priyanka Shah had been even slightly less careful, or if I'd been slightly less inclined, after 40 years of reading A Room for Trouble before it fully arrived, to notice the small wrongness in my daughter-in-law's voice on a car ride home. Vincent Marlowe testified on the 5th day, describing the original buyout agreement, the intended scope of the authorization form, and the moment at the dinner table when he'd recognized me in front of my own family. Under cross-examination, Finch tried, understandably, to suggest that the restaurant industry's paperwork was informal enough that a broader reading of the authorization wasn't unreasonable. Vincent, patient in the way I'd trained him to be over 2 decades, simply pulled up the plain language of the form itself and read the limiting clause aloud, slowly, twice, until the argument had nowhere left to go. "One more question, Mr. Marlowe," Finch said, clearly hoping to salvage something from the exchange. "Isn't it true that Mr. Cobb has, on prior occasions, been generous with his family financially, helping with a wedding, offering rides, covering meals? Wouldn't a reasonable person in your client's position believe that generosity extended to this kind of arrangement as well?" Vincent considered the question with the same unhurried patience he brought to a difficult table. "Generosity that's freely given is exactly that, freely given," he said. "What happened here wasn't Nate offering something. It was someone attempting to take something using paperwork he never agreed applied to it, through a phone call built from his own recorded voice without his knowledge. Those aren't the same thing, Mr. Finch, and I don't think a reasonable person would confuse them." Finch had no follow-up. Douglas Ashcroft took the stand on the 6th day, and I watched him settle into the witness box with the same easy confidence I remembered from the handful of family gatherings where I'd met him over the years. A tall, silver-haired man who had built a career on convincing people that ambitious things were also safe things. His attorney walked him through a version of the story in which he had simply been exploring creative financing structures available to family members of his business partners, and in which any irregularities in the paperwork were the result of overzealous junior staff at his firm rather than any deliberate intent on his part. Bello rose for cross-examination with the patience of a woman who had been waiting for this exact moment for months. "Mr. Ashcroft, you've testified that any irregularities in the conversion request were the result of junior staff error. Is that your testimony?" "Yes," Ashcroft said. "I'd like to direct your attention to Prosecution Exhibit 52, already admitted into evidence," Bello said. "This is an email you sent personally, from your own account, to the junior associate who prepared the conversion request." She held the page a moment before reading it aloud. "Use the 2016 authorization, not the updated one Preston mentioned. The language is looser and legal won't have time to flag it before the capital call deadline. If the transfer agent system kicks it back, we'll call in directly and have Preston's wife handle it, since her father-in-law trusts the family more than he'll ever trust a form letter." Bello lowered the page. "Mr. Ashcroft, did you personally select the 2016 authorization specifically because its language was, in your own words, looser?" Ashcroft's easy confidence flickered, just slightly, the way a pilot light dims before catching itself again. "I was advising my team on the most efficient path forward," he said. "I wasn't instructing anyone to commit fraud. You wrote that if the system flagged the request, quote, we'll call in directly and have Preston's wife handle it, since her father-in-law trusts the family more than he'll ever trust a form letter," Bello repeated. "Isn't that email describing, in your own words, a plan to use Mr. Cobb's trust in his own family as a mechanism to bypass a legitimate compliance flag?" "That's one interpretation," Ashcroft said. "Is there another interpretation you'd like to offer the jury?" Bello asked. There was a long pause, long enough that I watched more than one juror shift in their seat. "No," Ashcroft said finally. "I don't suppose there is." Kim testified on the 7th day, called by her own attorney in an attempt to establish, before the jury reached a verdict on her lesser charge, that her role had been limited to conversations she'd participated in rather than decisions she'd actively structured. She sat in the witness box in a charcoal blazer, hands folded carefully, and described a version of events in which her father had made every technical decision, in which she had gone along out of loyalty to her family's business and financial pressure she hadn't fully understood, and in which she had never intended any real harm to come to me. "I care about Nate," she said, and her voice caught in a way that seemed, at least from where I sat in the gallery, genuinely felt, even if I could no longer be entirely certain what genuine meant coming from her by that point. I thought there was enough there for everyone, if we just structured it the right way. The prosecutor, Adiz Bello, rose for cross-examination with the patience of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment since jury selection began. Mrs. Cobb, she said, you've testified that your role was limited to conversations, and that the structuring of the request belonged to your father. Is that correct? Yes, Kim said. I'd like to direct your attention to Prosecution Exhibit 31, already admitted into evidence, Bello said. This is a text message recovered from your personal phone, sent to your father 6 weeks before the conversion request was submitted. She held the page a moment before reading it aloud, without inflection. I found the original authorization form in Preston's files from the buyout. It only covers address and beneficiary changes technically, but the wording is vague enough that if we frame the request as a routine portfolio rebalancing, most transfer agents won't dig into the fine print. Worth trying before we ask Nate directly and risk him saying no. Bello lowered the page. Mrs. Cobb, who located that original authorization form and identified the specific language you believed could be exploited? Kim's folded hands went very still. I found it while going through Preston's files, she said. I didn't draft the request myself. You identified the exact clause your father's team used to structure a request you now testify was entirely his idea, Bello said. Is there an explanation for that text message you'd like to offer the jury? There was a long pause, long enough that I watched more than one juror lean forward slightly. No, Kim said finally, quietly. I don't think there is. One more matter, Mrs. Cobb, Bello said. You've heard testimony this week describing 9 months of recorded video calls between your husband and his father, used to construct a synthesized voice authorization. Were you aware those calls were being made, and for what purpose? Kim's attorney rose. Objection, this exceeds the scope of the charges against my client. I'll allow it, given the overall pattern at issue, the judge said. The witness may answer. Kim was quiet for a long moment. I knew Preston was recording calls with his father, she said finally. He told me it was for the voice authorization, as a backup plan, in case the paperwork route didn't work. I told him I didn't love the idea, but I didn't tell him to stop. The courtroom stayed very quiet after that admission, quieter than it had been for any of the testimony that came before it. Douglas Ashcroft's attorney called a character witness on his behalf before resting the defense's case, a longtime business partner named Harlan Voss, no relation to Earl Jessup despite the similar surname, who described Ashcroft as a generous, community-minded developer who had personally funded scholarships and sponsored Little League teams for over a decade. Douglas has done more good for this town than most people ever will, Voss told the jury, and I watched several jurors nod along, the way people naturally do when someone speaks with genuine conviction about a person they believe they know well. Bello's cross-examination was brief and precise. Mr. Voss, are you aware of the testimony given this week by Miriam Voigt-Ellis and Adaora Okafor-Reyes regarding their parents' financial losses connected to Ashcroft Hospitality Ventures? I've heard some of it, yes, Voss said carefully. Does knowing about those losses change your assessment of Mr. Ashcroft's character, or do you believe a person can be both generous with scholarships and also, separately, capable of the conduct described in this trial? Voss hesitated for a long moment. I suppose people can be more than one thing, he said finally, echoing, without knowing it, almost exactly the words I would find myself using about my own son in the months that followed. Thank you, Mr. Voss, Bello said. Nothing further. By the 8th day of trial, with Stanley Kroger's financial testimony, Priyanka Shah's compliance record, Dr. Ramanathan's forensic voice analysis, Douglas Ashcroft's own email, and Harlan Voss's character testimony all having landed in ways that visibly narrowed the defense's remaining options, Renee told me quietly during a recess that Finch had requested a closed-door meeting with the prosecutor. That usually means one thing at this stage, she said. He's testing the waters on a plea before this goes to the jury, and he loses control of the outcome entirely. She was right. Vincent came with me to the courthouse the following morning, sitting beside me in the gallery with the same steady presence he'd offered at the dinner table 2 years earlier, while Bellow and Finch spent nearly 3 hours negotiating in chambers. When the judge finally called the parties back into the courtroom, I felt something close to disbelief alongside the dread, the particular disorientation of an ending arriving faster than you'd braced yourself for it to. I did not feel triumphant when Douglas Ashcroft stood and entered his guilty plea to all 3 remaining counts, which surprised me at the time, though it doesn't surprise me now, looking back. What I felt instead was something closer to exhaustion finally being allowed to set down what it had been carrying for 2 years. Not joy exactly, but the specific relief of a structure that had held, under real weight, exactly as it had been built to hold. Douglas Ashcroft did not testify further in his own defense after his own cross-examination, and his attorney negotiated a plea agreement covering the remaining counts 2 weeks into the trial, once it became clear that between the dashcam recording, Priyanka Shah's compliance testimony, Dr. Ramanathan's forensic analysis, his own email about the 2016 authorization, and the testimony from Eleanor Voigt's and Walter Okafor's daughters, there was very little room left for an alternative account of what had happened. He pleaded guilty to securities fraud, attempted unauthorized transfer of assets, and elder financial exploitation across all 3 victims, with the forensic accountant's testimony establishing the full scope of the pattern spanning nearly 5 years. Kim pleaded guilty to a lesser conspiracy charge and received probation along with a restitution order covering the legal costs the case had generated. Preston was not charged. The evidence, in the end, supported Renee's early assessment that his involvement had been closer to willful blindness and, in the matter of the recorded calls, active if perhaps not fully considered participation, though the judge noted at Kim's sentencing that willful blindness within a marriage carries its own kind of cost, one the courtroom couldn't fully measure. At sentencing, the judge noted for the record that the case was unusual for the completeness of its evidentiary foundation, established almost entirely through the diligence of the victim and the conscientiousness of a compliance officer, well before law enforcement became involved. She added that she found the underlying scheme, targeting a 74-year-old man's equity stake in the very business he had built from nothing, using paperwork he had signed in good faith years earlier as an unwitting instrument against himself, backed by a voice clone from months of calls made under the pretense of preserving cherished memories, to be a particularly calculated form of exploitation, dressed up in the language of family and opportunity, and made considerably worse by evidence that this was neither an isolated incident nor a moment of panic, but the 3rd documented iteration of a pattern spanning nearly 5 years and at least 2 other families. Douglas Ashcroft received 7 years, with restitution ordered to all 3 affected families, full restitution to Eleanor Voigt's estate for the partial transfer years earlier, and full restitution, with interest, to Walter Okafor's daughter for the $90,000 her father had never recovered before his death. Kim's probation ran for 3 years, with a restitution order covering the legal costs incurred by both my case and, at her attorney's request as a gesture toward the court's leniency, a portion of the costs incurred by the Okafor family's renewed pursuit of their claim. Miriam Voigt Ellis, Eleanor's daughter, found me in the hallway after the sentencing concluded, and thanked me in a way I still think about often. "My mother wanted me to tell you something," she said. "She said to tell you that she spent 2 years believing she'd simply been foolish, and that whatever happens to you from here, you should know you gave her back 2 years of feeling foolish that she never should have lost in the first place." I didn't have a ready response for that. I simply shook her hand and told her I was glad, genuinely glad, that her mother finally had that back. Before sentencing concluded, the judge permitted victim impact statements, and I stood, with Renee's quiet encouragement, and said the only thing I'd prepared, because 40 years in a business built on getting exactly one chance to make a first impression had taught me that fewer words, chosen carefully, land harder than many words chosen in anger. I said that I built Cobb's Chop House out of a failed shoe repair shop and a $9,000 loan because I wanted to leave my son something that meant more than money. A place, a name, a way of treating people that outlasted any single transaction. I said that my late wife Roz had believed in that place before it ever made a dollar, and that every table we ever sat down at together, we'd sat down as equals, regardless of who was paying and who was driving. I said I never expected the thing I'd need protecting from would be a paper trail drawn out of my own trust in my own family, or a voice built from months of calls I'd believed, foolishly perhaps, were simply about a son wanting to remember his father clearly. I said I did not stand there wanting revenge, only wanting the truth recorded plainly, so it could never again be dismissed as a misunderstanding over dinner, and so that Eleanor Voigt and Walter Okafor's family would finally have the same thing. Then I sat down. After the courtroom cleared, Preston found me in the hallway outside, alone, Kim already gone with her attorney to begin the paperwork for her probation terms. He looked, standing there, thinner than I'd seen him look in months, and for a moment he reminded me so strongly of the boy who used to do his homework at that two-top in the corner of the restaurant that my chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with anger at all. "Dad," he said, "I didn't know the details. I want you to believe that." But I knew enough to wonder, and I didn't ask, because some part of me didn't want the answer to be what it turned out to be. I looked at my son for a long moment, the way I used to look at a table that had gone quiet in a way that meant something was wrong, deciding whether to walk over or wait for them to come to me first. "I believe you didn't know the details," I said finally. "I'm having a harder time believing you didn't know enough to ask. 40 years in that business taught me that the people who get hurt worst aren't usually the ones being actively lied to. They're the ones who let themselves stay comfortably uninformed, because knowing would have cost them something." "I recorded those calls, Dad," Preston said, and his voice broke properly for the first time since he'd walked over. "I told myself it was because I wanted to remember you talking about the old days, about Mom, about the restaurant when it was just a shoe repair shop with your name on butcher paper taped to the window. Some of that was even true. But I knew, somewhere underneath that, why Kim's father wanted the recordings, and I let myself keep telling the sentimental version of the story because it was easier than admitting what I actually understood. "That's the first time you've said that plainly," I said. "Not to a lawyer, not on a witness stand. Just to me." "I know," he said. "I should have said it a long time ago." "Why didn't you?" I asked, and I meant it as a genuine question, not an accusation, though I understood it might land as both. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I wondered if he'd answer at all. "Because as long as I didn't say it out loud to you directly, some part of me could keep pretending it hadn't really happened yet," he said finally. "That's not an excuse. I know it's not an excuse. It's just the truest answer I have. I don't know yet whether I'll fully trust your judgment again the way I used to," I told him. "I hope, for both our sakes, that someday I might. But that depends entirely on what you do from here, not on anything either of us says in this hallway today. And it depends, more than anything, on whether Nora gets to grow up with a father who tells her the plain version of things the first time, instead of the sentimental one that's easier to live with." He nodded, and didn't try to argue with any of it, which was, in its own small way, the first fully honest thing he'd offered me in over a year. We stood there together a moment longer before he finally said he needed to go pick up Nora from school, and I told him to drive safely, and meant it the way you mean the ordinary things you say to someone you're still, despite everything, trying to find your way back to. "I still eat at the Chop House most weeks, same table near the kitchen pass that Vincent has kept reserved for me without ever quite calling it reserved. I still drive myself everywhere, and these days, when Preston asks me to pick up Nora from a birthday party or drive them somewhere for dinner, I say yes gladly, because I've decided that being generous with my time was never actually the problem. The problem was letting generosity be mistaken for invisibility. Vincent and I still meet every few weeks to go over the restaurant group's numbers, mostly out of habit at this point, since he doesn't need my opinion nearly as much as he still asks for it, and I've started, at his suggestion, setting aside a small annual scholarship in Roz's name for culinary students who remind him, he says, of the 19-year-old dishwasher I once took a chance on. We awarded the first one last spring, to a 19-year-old girl working double shifts at a diner 2 towns over to help her mother with rent, and when I shook her hand at the small ceremony we held in the Chop House's private dining room, I thought, for just a moment, that I could feel Roz somewhere nearby, approving of exactly the kind of thing she always hoped that $18 of profit on a Tuesday night might eventually become. Detective Alvarez called me once more, unprompted, about 8 months after the sentencing, just to let me know, he said, that Priyanka Shah's compliance flag had since become something of a case study within the firm's fraud training materials, cited specifically as an example of what a properly skeptical compliance review looks like when an authorization scope doesn't match its use. Doesn't happen often that the person who protected you ends up training the next generation of people who'll protect somebody else, he said. I asked him to pass along my thanks to her directly, if it wasn't inappropriate, and a few weeks later I received a short, formal note from Priyanka herself, thanking me for the message and noting, in the careful language of someone still bound by professional restraint, that cases like mine were the reason she still believed the tedious parts of her job mattered. I keep that note in the same drawer where I keep Raza's old spiral notebook full of restaurant ideas from decades ago, two very different kinds of proof that paying close, patient attention to small details eventually adds up to something worth keeping. Odessa, the pastry chef who first taught Nora how to pipe a buttercream rosette, spoke briefly at that ceremony as well, describing what it had meant to her, years earlier, when Vincent gave her a chance in the kitchen despite a resume with almost nothing on it. This place has always been in the business of betting on people nobody else was willing to bet on, she said, and I remember looking over at Nora in the audience, 11 years old and paying closer attention than most of the adults in the room, and thinking that whatever else this whole ordeal had cost our family, it hadn't managed to take that particular inheritance away from her. Nora is 11 now, taller every time I see her, and she still comes by the restaurant most Saturdays, no longer needing the step stool at the pastry station, working now under Odessa's patient instruction on techniques considerably more advanced than a basic buttercream rosette. She knows, in the simplified, age-appropriate version her parents and I agreed on together, that her mother made some serious mistakes involving money, and that grown-up problems were handled by grown-up people whose job it was to handle them fairly. She has never once, in all the time since, asked me a question I wasn't prepared to answer honestly, at whatever level of detail felt right for an 11-year-old to carry. And I've come to believe that this, more than any courtroom outcome, more than any restitution order, is the thing I'm proudest of having protected through all of it, a granddaughter who still believes, correctly, that at least one adult in her family will always tell her the plain version of things. Preston and I are not what we were before that dinner, and I no longer expect we ever fully will be. But we are, slowly, something workable. Sunday dinners that have gotten a little easier each year. An honest conversation every few months that costs us both something but leaves less unsaid than the year before it. A relationship being rebuilt the same patient way I once rebuilt a dining room's trust after a bad review, one good service at a time, with no illusions that a single grand gesture could undo what 4 years of small, deniable choices had worn away. There was a Sunday dinner last spring, nearly 3 years after all of it began, when Preston brought over an old cardboard box he'd found while cleaning out his garage. File folders from his college years, mostly, forgotten term papers and financial aid paperwork he'd meant to shred years earlier. Near the bottom, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, was one of Raza's old spiral notebooks, the kind she used to fill with restaurant ideas back when I was still working other people's kitchens and dreaming about my own. Preston hadn't known what it was until he opened it and saw his mother's handwriting. He sat with me at the kitchen table that evening and we read through it together, page by page. Her careful notes about plating and walk-in organization, and the exact temperature at which prime rib stopped being forgiving, and for the first time in 3 years, we sat in a silence together that felt like the ordinary silences we used to share before any of this happened, rather than the careful, watchful silence that had followed us since. I didn't know she wrote all this down, Preston said, running his thumb along the edge of a page. I always just thought you were naturally good at it. I told him that nothing about building something worth keeping is ever entirely natural, that it's mostly just careful, patient attention, paid consistently, over a long enough time that it starts to look like instinct from the outside. He was quiet for a while after that, and I think, though I can't be entirely certain, that he understood I wasn't only talking about the restaurant. I think often about the son I raised and the man who stood in that hallway, uncertain and ashamed, and I have found, the way I once told a young server who'd made an honest mistake with an order, that people are rarely only one thing. The boy who did his homework at that two-top loved me. The man who let his wife and her father structure a scheme against my own trust in him, and who recorded 9 months of my voice under a sentimental excuse he half believed himself, loved his own comfort more, at least for a while, than he loved the harder, more honest version of protecting his father. I have not found a way to hold both truths without it costing me something, and I've stopped expecting that I will. Some things, once you understand exactly how they broke, are never trusted quite the same way again, even after they're repaired. I've come to think that's not necessarily a tragedy. It's simply what remains true after the repair holds. A little more careful, a little more honestly earned, but still standing, still capable of bearing real weight. If there's a lesson in any of this, it's the one I told Vincent over a late dinner not long after the sentencing, when he finally asked me the question he'd clearly been sitting on for months: whether I regretted not confronting Kim and Preston the moment I first heard that recording. I told him no. I told him that in 40 years running a restaurant, I never once fixed a bad night in the dining room by yelling into the kitchen. You find out calmly precisely what actually went wrong, who was responsible, and what it will take to make sure it never happens the same way twice. Then, and only then, do you decide what to do about it. Vincent sat with that answer a while before responding, turning his wine glass slowly by the stem the way he does when he's genuinely working through something rather than just being polite. I think about that dinner sometimes, he said finally. The look on your face when Kim said you were just the driver. I almost said something sharper than I did. I'm glad now that I didn't, because sharper wouldn't have gotten you any closer to what you actually needed, which wasn't an apology at the table. It was time, and quiet, and enough rope for the whole thing to show itself properly. I told him that was about the kindest, most accurate thing anyone had said to me in the better part of 2 years, and we didn't talk about it again after that. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because some conversations are complete once they've said the one true thing they needed to say. Vincent pushed back a little that night, more than he usually does. But there's a cost to that, Nate, he said. You carried this alone for almost a year before anyone else knew. That's not nothing. It isn't, I agreed. I won't pretend it was easy, sitting across from my own son at Sunday dinner knowing what I knew and saying nothing about it. There were nights I lay awake wanting badly to just ask him plainly, to give him one chance to tell me the truth himself before any of this became irreversible. I think, in a different version of this story, maybe I would have done exactly that, and maybe it would have gone differently. But every lawyer I spoke to, every detective, every compliance officer who did her job carefully instead of rushing a file through, they all told me the same thing in different words. The moment you announce what you know, you lose the ability to learn anything more. And in this case, what I learned in the months I stayed quiet, the second forgery attempt, the synthesized voice, the family friend's visit, the 2 other families who'd already been hurt the same way, none of that would have come to light if I'd confronted Kim and Preston the week I found out. So the price of the full truth was staying quiet longer than felt right, Vincent said. That's about the size of it, I said. I don't know if that's a comfortable lesson. I know it's an honest one. Vincent turned his wine glass slowly between his fingers for a while before speaking again. Do you think you could have caught all of it without going that long without saying anything? He asked. The second call, the family friend, Eleanor and Walter, all of it? No, I said, and I didn't have to think long to answer. Every piece of it depended on the last piece holding. If I'd confronted Preston the week I found the recording, Ashcroft never tries the synthesized voice call, because there'd be no reason to. If there's no synthesized voice call, Dr. Ramanathan never gets involved, and we never trace it back to 9 months of recorded conversations. If we never trace that, we never think to ask whether Ashcroft had done this before, and Eleanor Voigt and Walter Okafor's daughter spend the rest of their lives believing what happened to them was simply bad luck, or their own carelessness. I set my own glass down. Patience wasn't just the safer path, Vincent. It was the only path that led anywhere beyond my own kitchen table. He nodded slowly, the way he used to nod at the end of a long service, when the numbers finally added up the way they were supposed to. I don't think I could have done it, he said. Sat on something like that for a year. I'm not sure I could have either, if I'd known ahead of time how long it would take, I told him. I think the only reason I managed it is that I never let myself think about the whole year at once. Just the next week. Then the week after that. I think, too, about Eleanor Voigt and Walter Okafor, 2 people I still have never met in person, though Miriam Voitelis and I have exchanged a handful of warm, careful emails since the sentencing, the kind 2 strangers write to each other when they've been connected by something neither of them would have chosen, but are grateful, in the end, to have shared. Miriam sent me a photograph last winter of her mother, Eleanor, sitting in a garden Miriam had helped her plant the spring after the sentencing. The first thing Eleanor had planted in years, Miriam told me, since she'd spent so long feeling too foolish and too tired to invest in anything that required tending. She said the case gave her back her hands, Miriam wrote, not just her money. She'd stopped trusting her own judgment about almost everything, and watching your case go all the way through gave her some of that back. I keep that photograph, printed out, in the same drawer where I once kept the original conversion authorization form, and I look at it sometimes when I need reminding that patience, however costly, rarely protects only the person practicing it. I think about how easily my own case could have gone the same quiet, unresolved way theirs almost did, if Priyanka Shah had processed that first request without a second glance, or if Vincent hadn't caught the flatness in that cloned voice before I fully understood what I was hearing, or if Earl Jessup's offhand comment about the courthouse had simply evaporated the way most offhand comments do. Patience mattered enormously in how this all turned out. But so did the small, careful diligence of people who had no obligation to notice anything at all, and noticed anyway. Family stories about being underestimated rarely announce themselves the way you'd expect. They arrive quietly, in a comment tossed off to a waiter without a second thought, a paper authorization signed in good faith years before anyone thought to misuse it, a dashcam installed for an entirely unrelated reason 15 years earlier that happens to be running at exactly the wrong moment for the people who forgot it was there. But they can end, if you're patient enough and careful enough, with the truth laid out so plainly in a courtroom that no one can talk their way around it, and with an old man back at his usual table near the kitchen pass, greeted by name, exactly where he's always belonged. The young waiter from that night, whose name I eventually learned was Desmond, still works the floor at the flagship location most Friday evenings, and he mentioned to me, not long ago, over a quiet moment between tables, that he still thinks about that dinner sometimes. The strange half-second where he genuinely didn't know what to do with the check, caught between what Kim had told him and what his own read of the room was telling him instead. I almost said something, he told me. I almost asked if that was really how you wanted it handled. I'm glad Vincent got there before I had to decide. I told him he'd done exactly the right thing, which was nothing at all, and letting someone more senior step in when a table gets complicated, and that the instinct itself, noticing that something didn't add up, was worth more than he probably realized. I've since asked Vincent to keep an eye on him for the assistant manager position opening up next year. Some instincts are worth cultivating. Desmond asked me once, hesitantly, whether I'd ever told Kim and Preston what he'd almost said that night. I told him I hadn't, and that I didn't think it mattered much either way at this point, that the value of what he'd noticed wasn't in whether it ever got reported back to the people it concerned, but in the fact that he'd noticed it at all, the way a good server notices when a regular's usual order feels wrong for their mood that night, or when a first date at table 9 has gone quiet in a way that isn't comfortable. That kind of attention is the whole job, really, I told him. Everything else is just carrying plates. I don't know, even now, exactly what Roz would have made of everything that happened. The dinner, the recordings, the trial, the strange, unwanted intimacy of learning two strangers' family tragedies alongside my own. But I know she would have approved of the scholarship in her name, and I know, with more certainty than I can fully explain, that she would have approved of Nora still coming in on Saturdays to learn from Odessa, still believing, correctly, that the restaurant was the best one in the whole world, probably. Some things, even after everything, are worth protecting exactly as carefully as I once protected the $18 of profit that convinced her, all those years ago, that we might actually make it. If this story reached you, tell me honestly in the comments, have you ever been dismissed in public by someone who had no idea who they were actually talking to? Would you have said something at the table that night, or waited the way Nate did? Tell me whether you think Preston's hallway apology changed anything, or whether some apologies simply arrive after the thing they're apologizing for can no longer be undone. Tell me, too, whether you think Nate was right to stay silent that Tuesday night in December when Preston called him lonely and half-drunk, missing his mother, or whether you think some doors are worth pushing open even at the risk of losing whatever careful case you've built. And if you've ever spent months documenting something quietly instead of confronting it right away, I want to know what finally told you it was time to stop watching and start acting. Because for Nate, that moment was a compliance officer's phone call he never expected, and for someone else reading this, it might be something else entirely. Share this with someone who needs the reminder that being underestimated is sometimes the safest place in the room to gather exactly what you need. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time. There's more where this came from. If stories like this one resonate with you, let me know in the comments which part stayed with you longest. The dinner table itself, the compliance officer's careful phone call, or the quiet hallway conversation between a father and son who are still, in their own slow way, trying to find their way back to each other. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. It means more than you know. A final note before we go. Some stories on this channel include fictional elements, crafted to explore real emotional truths and life lessons. If that's not the kind of content you're looking for, that's completely alright. We hope you'll find something else on the channel that suits you better. We'll see you in the next one.